Hey, my name is Justin. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope City. My wife is supposed to be up here with me, team teaching, and I don't know. Oh, hello. Nice nightgown.
So, I heard a little story that Justin shared on me about
It wasn't
my
necessarily
sleepwear.
on her, okay? It was 2 weeks ago. I was talking about how we have expectations for intimacy in marriage, and I might have had an extra double XL nightgown and said that women don't want to be sexy, they want to be
since
comfortable.
we're talking about sexual intimacy, I would just set the mood with the nightgown. So thank you for that, baby. Thank you.
That definitely does set a mood. I'm not going to say what kind of mood, but it definitely does set one. So, hey, if you are in, I'm going to say under 6th grade and you're in this room, you may want to have your child go to Hope City Kids. Over the next few minutes, we're going to talk about something that the church doesn't talk about quite a bit, and if you don't want any awkward conversations at lunch, that would just be my suggestion to you. We have awesome Hope City Kids programming, but we've been in this relationship series over the last 3 weeks. This is our 3rd week, and we've really just been diving into this idea of how we all have expectations that we bring into a relationship, and a lot of times those expectations are unmet, right? And then we don't know what to do. We have these hopes and dreams, and these hopes and dreams turn into unmet expectations, and it creates distance in our relationship. And so we're trying to recapture not just our vision for relationships, but what does God say about relationships, and how can we grow in our relationships with one another? And so last week I talked about, Trish and I wrote a marriage book a few years ago, and we travel and speak. We were in Illinois yesterday. I don't even know what city, but we're in Illinois yesterday doing a marriage conference. And we just have not shared our story here. We've tried to keep that aspect of our life separate from the church, and I just felt convicted about that. And so our book these cost us $5.50. We're selling them for $5, and it'll tell a little bit more of our story, a little bit more of the marriage principles that we're going to talk about today. But last week, someone bought 10 books and said if anybody can't afford $5, there's a free book back there. And so I don't know how many books we have back there that are still free, but at the end of last service, I think there was still 7 of those 10 that were still available. So if you want to get a book and you don't have $5, then it's free for you. Somebody pre-purchased it for you, all right? And so we're excited to dive in. We're going to share a little bit of our story today with the hopes that you find yourself in the story.
And so the reality of expectation that is true for all of us is that we have this vision of what we think our relationship should be. We have this vision of what marriage and life together will look like. And Justin and I were no different. We had our own expectations. Unfortunately, our expectations began in the 90s. Anybody get married in the 90s? Yeah, everything was super unfortunate in the 90s. Like, think Bedazzled Machine, meets Cinderella. It's just, I don't know. My veil's like attacking my friend Brooke. It's just awful. But we had this expectation to have not only just an amazing wedding day, but an amazing honeymoon. I grew up in kind of a blue-collar, low-income family. We didn't have a lot of money to go on vacation. And the one vacation we had gone on that was like epic was to Wisconsin Dells. Anybody? Okay, they have more than cheese. It was amazing. And the one vacation Justin had gone on was to Holden Beach, North Carolina. And so we were 20 and 21 when we got married. And in our minds, we assumed that we could only go on a honeymoon to a place we had already been. I'm not sure why. So it was either the Dells or the beach. Thankfully, the beach won out. And the problem was we got married in Joliet, which is south of Chicago, not close to the Carolinas. And you guys are smart enough to know, it's not the best trip to take your first night married. So we decided we'll get through the wedding day, through the reception, we'll drive a couple of hours, stay at a hotel, and make the long trip the next day. What was super amazing is that Justin's parents had gotten their first brand new car they'd ever owned. And it was the sexiest. You remember the 1990 teal? Anybody remember the teal with the pinstripes? It was the sexiest 1995 Astra minivan you had ever seen, right? And we got to take it on our honeymoon. And so we get in the car. We're so excited. We make our way to the hotel. And what should have taken just 3 hours ended up taking forever. It was forever, to the point that by the time we got to the hotel room, ladies, we have this expectation, right? That our man is going to scoop us up. He's going to carry us over the threshold. It's going to be amazing. And we get to the hotel, and I was like, dude, you need to get to stepping and get out of my way. I am so tired. I don't know if you've been a part of this day, but it's been a long day, and I just need to go to sleep.
And sleep was the operative word there, and I was like, oh, let's call a time out, my friend. I didn't get married to go to sleep, right? I got married for some action, so let's light a candle, let's throw on some Boys to Men, but let's get this party started.
So as he tried to get the party started, I was in the bathroom, and I wasn't just crying, but I was sobbing, which is never good your first night married. And he knocks on the door, and he's like, "Are you okay?" And the only thing I could get out of my mouth was, "I need you to go to Walmart. Like right now, I need you to go to Walmart."
I just thought, why would I go to Walmart at 4 o'clock in the morning on my wedding night in my tuxedo? Well, apparently, as we arrived at the hotel, something else arrived for Trish. And so I walked down 2 aisles that day. The first aisle to say I do, and then the feminine product aisle to say I'm not so sure. And I have a sister, I've never bought those for her, and so I just bought one of everything. And you know you're in a bad place in your life when the person working the 4 a.m. shift at Walmart feels sorry for you, right? And she's looking at me, I'm like, just please check me out. My wife is eagerly anticipating my arrival at the hotel.
Yeah, I was totally asleep. I'm not going to lie.
No action.
So, yeah.
Nada.
We've been in therapy for 22 years. But so we wake up the next morning, we make the long trip to the beach. We are young and in love, not very bright, and just decide to not check in where we're staying, but just to check out the ocean. And we played in the ocean water for the next 3 hours. Well, a little known fact about me, which I think it's just apparent, I don't know why people are confused, is that I'm Hispanic. Okay, whatever. So my maiden name is Lopez, and although I'm a fair-skinned Latina, I don't ever remember growing up in the Midwest and getting a sunburned blister burn. You know, like sunburn, blister burn from head to toe. And after 3 hours of being in the Carolina ocean water, I was sunburn, blister burn to the point that I was like, "Baby, I need you to not touch me, like at all. In fact, I need you to not talk to me because your breath, it hurts my face."
For the next 3 days, nothing touched her body but aloe vera. And you know you're in an epically bad place on your honeymoon, you're calling your dad collect, because that's what you do in 1995. Some of you need to Google what a collect call is, okay? And you're talking to your father about the action you're not having on your honeymoon. It's a very awkward conversation. And my dad's like, 4 days and nothing? I'm like, "Yeah, is that normal?" He's like, "Well, in a few years it will be, but not right now," right? He's like, "You know, we're not even Catholic, but I think you can annul that. Just high five and walk away."
Yeah, we're really close. And so the very last day of our honeymoon, we had all of this money because we couldn't do anything, that I decided I'm going to be an amazing bride and I'm going to rent a jet ski. Because renting a jet ski for my young groom with lots of pent-up energy is wise. And so we get on this jet ski, and this was the moment in our relationship that we defined who the rule follower is and who the rule breaker is. So who are my rule followers here today? Raise your hand. Yeah, you're my people. Who are my rule breakers? Yeah. I didn't ask you to laugh. Just raise your hand. There's no laughing, right? Well, I'm the rule follower. Justin's the rule breaker. We get on this jet ski, and rule followers, I think it's only fair that I get to go over the rules of engagement on how to ride this thing. But before we can do anything, say anything, the whole I whip my hair back and forth is going on. And then all of a sudden, the hair parts, and the moment happens. You know that moment when time kind of slows down, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm about to die." This is this moment. There's this huge party yacht coming into the cove, and on the party yacht there's people and there's music playing, and they look really happy, and this party yacht is creating these huge waves, and my young groom is like, "Oh yes," and I'm like, "Oh no," and he's like, "Oh yes." So we go towards the boat full throttle. We hit a wave so hard and so fast, I shoot straight up in the air to the point I'm like, "What's up?" to the people on the party yacht, and then I fall into a belly flop position. And when I came out, all of my blisters had popped.
And I was like, "Payback." I mean, I didn't say it out loud. I was just silently enjoying the moment to myself.
Yeah. But here's the deal. We had this expectation of intimacy from the very beginning. And from the very beginning, the expectation that we had and what came into fruition was completely broken.
And so we get married the summer before my second senior year of college. And so we're in college, we're young, we're in love. And Tricia gets pregnant 4 months into marriage, and so our whole life really just changes from what we had expected it to look like to what it actually looks like. And I graduated, and we dove headfirst into student ministry. We did student ministry for 7 years. And then 7 years into ministry, we felt like God was laying on our heart this vision to plant a church for people who didn't go to church. And so in June of 2002, we moved to Noblesville to plant our very first church. And we had $5,000 to our name, and we just thought, by turning around this money, we should have a church going. Which sounds very faith-filled. It's not a very wise way to start a church, but that was our vision. And so we moved June 1st, 2002, and on June 9th, we had our very first service. And 12 people showed up. Now, those of you that have been a part of Hope City, we're 18 months old, right? You know that as a new church, you're looking for any sign at all that God may be remotely in this. And I'm thinking 12 people, 12 disciples, this is biblical. 3 of these people are wearing sandals. Jesus himself wore sandals. WWJD, it's anointed, okay? And it's going to work. And so that 12 people became 20, and 20 became 25, and eventually we had about 50 people on our launch team. We launched services in September of 2003. From September of 2003 into Easter of 2005, our church grew to about 800 people. But more than just the numbers, like people were coming back to God, and people who hadn't been to church in years were coming back to church, and people who were far from God were being baptized, and they were joining small groups, and they were going on mission trips. And it was just this amazing season of life and this amazing season of our church. But even as the church was going up and to the right, and we had 3 young boys, and we had, this growing church, and everything from the outside looking in on Trish and I's life looked amazing, and it looked like it was so successful. There were unmet expectations, and there were broken desires, and there were these things that began to erode not just our relationship with one another, but it began to erode my relationship with God. And I focused so much on growing in my giftedness, I failed to grow in my character. And anytime giftedness outweighs character, implosion isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so I came home from church October the 9th, 2005. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I said to Trish, I said, hey, we need to have a conversation. And she said, okay, about what? I said, about us. She's like, well, what about us? And I said, I'm done. She's like, you're done with what? I said, I'm done with you. Like, I'm out. I don't want to be married to you anymore. I don't want to be in ministry anymore. I'm not in love with you. I'm having an affair. It's with your best friend. I want to be with her. Like, I'm done. And I wish 12 years later, I wish it was a confession of remorse, and I wish it was a confession of repentance. It was just a confession of resignation. When Trish and I got married, we were awesome at fighting for each other, and then we became experts at fighting with each other, and now I was just done fighting. Obviously, the intensity of our conversation went way up, and Trish left the house, and it felt like seconds later, one of our elders called me on my cell phone, and he was just screaming at me. This has to be some kind of joke. Please tell me this is a sick joke. I had all the elders come over to our house, these 7 guys, 3 of whom had been with us since day one. We had just, our 3-year-old church, average age of 28, had just gone through a capital campaign. We raised $1 million to buy the building that we were meeting in, and one of the guys on our team had given $250,000 to that. And I had cheated on all of them too. And they sat there for the next few moments, not trying to talk me out of the consequences of my choice, because that was pretty much set, but the choice itself to leave my wife and my 3 young boys. And I was just in such a dark place, I just couldn't hear it. Trish didn't want me at the house anymore, and so I went and checked into a hotel. And as I arrived at the hotel, a lady from our church called, and she said, if you have any hope at all of restoring your marriage relationship, you're going to show up at this counseling appointment that we've made for you. And I just thought, counseling? I don't go to counseling. I'm a pastor. I do counseling. 10 years, never one counseling appointment. I kind of held it out like a badge of honor. By God's grace, I showed up at this counseling appointment the next day, rather defiantly. I sat down in the lady's chair and kind of told her the story about as much as I told you this morning, and she said, what do you hope to accomplish with this counseling session? And I said, you know what? If I'm just being straight up honest with you, if I'm just cutting through all the Christianese and all the church lingo, here's what I want to figure out. I want you to help me figure out how God's going to bless my life no matter who I choose. Like, that's what I want. And she said something in that moment that became the linchpin for the restoration that God was going to do in our marriage. She said, I can help broken people. I can't help hard-hearted people. I've been a Christian since I was 10 years old. I've been a pastor for 10 years. I didn't really know what brokenness was. Never really experienced it. Over the next few days, God would begin to break my heart and give me a desire to have my marriage back, but it wasn't my choice anymore. Trish had packed up my things and kicked me out of the house. She'd moved me in with a couple that had helped us start the church. We didn't talk for the next 10 days, and we were separated for 2.5 months, and I started going to counseling by myself, not knowing if I was going to be given a second chance or not. 10 days into counseling, Tricia called me on my cell phone, and I tell people all the time, if the prodigal son's dad would have had a cell phone, this would have been a call he would have made. And she said, I hear you've been going to counseling. I said, yes. She said, well, I'm willing to go with you. So we started going to counseling a few days later. Went to counseling 4 days a week for the next 2 months. So we tell couples all the time, if you feel like your marriage is in trouble, our counselor wanted to see us 4 days a week. That's how jacked up we were, okay? Hang in there. It's going to be okay. The only reason we didn't go on Friday is they were closed, okay? So you probably would have saw us 5 days a week. But God began to use those counseling sessions to peel back layers of brokenness and layers of dysfunction and hurt and bitterness and half-truths that we hadn't had the courage or the time to talk about, and began a restoration process that continues in our marriage to this day. And some of you are here for the first time, you're like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? And we share that story with you this morning before we talk about what intimacy looks like, because I think what has happened so often in the church is one of two things. The church has either avoided the topic of sexual intimacy altogether, or they have brought such a sense of shame and guilt and misguided conviction into this area to where people don't even want to associate sexual intimacy with Christianity. The problem with that is God invented it. God created it. And the Bible is full of instruction. The Bible is full of examples. The Bible is full of truth as it pertains to this area of our life. And so we wanted to share with you the honeymoon story because from the very beginning, like 3 days into marriage, this part of our relationship was not exactly firing on all cylinders. And then 10 years into marriage, it completely disintegrated. And it had to be rebuilt. And one of the passages that we talked about in the first week of this series is this passage in Genesis chapter 2 that kind of introduces the idea of intimacy in general. And it's a passage of Scripture that I think we become familiar with and that we kind of read over, but I just want to bring us back to it. It's going to set the tone and the stage for what we're going to talk today. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 13 through 25, it says, "At last the man exclaimed, this one is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." We talked to this idea that there's a special aspect of a relationship when you feel no shame in a relationship, when you can feel fully known and you can feel fully loved. And that was Adam and Eve in this moment. They were fully exposed before each other. They were fully exposed before God, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And we said this in week 1, that intimacy, God created you for intimacy. And that intimacy literally means to be fully known. So it doesn't matter your marital status. It doesn't matter how long you've been married, if you're not married, if you're single again, if you're a widower. It doesn't matter what your marital status is. God created you for intimacy. There's a desire in your heart to be known by God and to be known by others. And if you're in a marriage relationship, your relationship in a marriage is created for you to be fully known. And so often what happens is we compromise this idea of being fully known in a marriage relationship and don't understand why we're not experiencing intimacy. And so what we want to do today is we want to unpack what does intimacy really look like, and how can we pursue it with the same intensity and the same purpose that we pursue communication, that we pursue conflict resolution, that we pursue forgiveness. And not just segregate this part of our relationship and say, well, that's just something that we don't talk about, or something that we don't think about, or something that that God doesn't approve of, because that cannot be further from the truth.
And so the reality is that many of us, because we're not talking about it, Justin and I go all over the country. It doesn't matter ethnic background. It doesn't matter if it's a Pentecostal church or if it's a conservative church. We keep asking this question. It was the same question when we were separated and going through that intense counseling. What does God say about sexual intimacy? And the question we ask is, how many of you had a clear biblical understanding of sexual intimacy before you got married? And it's just crickets. And so there's so many of us that are struggling in this area, and then the church isn't talking about it, and then we don't even really know its purpose. So I want to look at a passage of Scripture that is super familiar, but I want you to think about it in the lens of this area of our life, of sexual intimacy, because what we've heard, what Justin just read, is the story of us. The story of Adam and Eve that begins in Genesis chapter 2. And in the very last verse of Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, it says, "Although Adam and his wife were both naked, neither of them felt shame." Like, that word is very specific, that neither of them felt shame. The problem is is that the vision that God creates for our marriage relationship, intimacy, to be fully known emotionally, spiritually, and physically, is decimated by chapter 3, verse 1. And it says this. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say?'" And I just want to pause there. Because if you're anything like me, I usually glance over this part of the narrative. That Satan doesn't take the fruit off the tree and then shove it in Eve's mouth and sin enters into our lives. He just poses a question. And I think it's a question we keep asking ourselves, regardless if you're married or if you're single. Did God really say that intimacy is purposed? Did God really say that you can have a relationship where you can be fully known emotionally and spiritually, be fully naked and not feel shame? And you guys know how the story goes on. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? And the woman says to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die." "You will not die. You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman. "For God knows that when you eat from the tree, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took it and she ate it. This wrecks me every time I think about it. Every time I read these words and I think about what we struggle with in 2018 in the area of sexual intimacy, it says, "So she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God, and he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees. But the Lord God called out to the man, 'Where are you?' He goes searching, and he answers, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid.' And he said, 'Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?' And the man said, 'The woman you put here with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate it.' And then the Lord said to the woman, 'What is this that you have done?'" I find it interesting that in this passage, that the immediate response is shame. The immediate response is hiddenness and blame. And if we're honest, wouldn't we describe that as sexual intimacy? That those are the buzzwords that oftentimes the broken view we have of it has to do with shame and blame and hiddenness. They become barriers in our marriage relationship. And then when we don't know the definition of it, it's always the source of contention. It's always the source of being misunderstood. And so what is God's view of sexual intimacy? How do we reclaim today Genesis chapter 2, verse 25? How can we live completely exposed and completely loved? And in order to get there, we have to realize that we face barriers in our relationship now. Hopefully not barriers that you're like hiding behind bushes and sewing fig leaves, because that would be weird, right? But what are the barriers to intimacy today? And the first one for me is just schedule, which the guys are like, what? Like that's never been. But Justin and I, we were married 4 months. I found out I was pregnant with our oldest son. And then he came 5 days after our first year anniversary. And so that child came and it changed everything. I was barely 21 years old. I didn't know how to raise a child. We lived 8 hours from any family. And I was all on my own. And so when I was wiping butts all day, the last thing I wanted to do is see another. Like, if I'm just being honest, it's just where I was. And so then more kids came, and then there was no sleep at all. And then there was work, and there was schedule after schedule, and everybody else had needs. And so this pattern kind of went like, if the kids took their nap, if, I was able to cook dinner because I'm a horrible cook. I always have been. Don't try to change me. I'm just bad at it. It's okay. But if dinner turned out halfway decent, if Justin came home on time, if the moon was aligned with Jupiter and the other stars, then maybe we would be intimate.
And I think if you allow schedule to be a barrier in this area of your life, it's always going to be a barrier. Because now our kids are older, right? And they know what it means when the door is shut. And our oldest won't walk in again without knocking because he did that one time and he's still in counseling, okay? So you can always allow schedule to be a barrier if you want it to be. I think the second barrier, if we're really honest, is unresolved conflict. If there's unresolved conflict in a relationship, there's going to be very little sexual chemistry. And I think for us as guys, the problem is a lot of the times is we reassociate avoided conflict with resolved conflict. And so if we can avoid an argument, if we're not arguing or if we're not fighting, then we must be cool, right? And you realize, man, my wife and I, we haven't argued in like 3 weeks. And she's like, I haven't talked to you in 3 weeks. That's how mad at you I've been, right? And so we associate avoided conflict with resolved conflict. But there's a reason why the term make-up sex exists, right? There's something physiologically that happens when somebody feels heard and understood and valued. This is the emotional aspect of intimacy. When you engage in the emotional aspect of intimacy in a relationship, it allows the relationship to be more desirable in the area of physical intimacy. And we're going to talk about how that looks in just a second. The next barrier, at least for me personally, I think it hurts a lot of couples, is a lack of sexual purity. Lack of sexual purity. I did not take this into account when Trish and I first got married. We... Just statistically speaking, we didn't take a poll of Hope City, but just statistically speaking, 50% of us in this room come from divorced homes. 100% of us on stage come from divorced homes. 50% of us in this room have or will experience divorce, statistically speaking. 50% of us in this room had sex before we were married, either with our spouse, with somebody that we dated before our spouse. Trish and I fall into that category. We both had sex, not with each other, and we want to do it right when we started dating. But we had sex in other dating relationships before we met one another. 33% of the women in this room, 1 out of 3, statistically speaking, have been sexually abused. 1 out of 6 men in this room, statistically speaking, have been sexually abused. 30% of the women in this room, statistically speaking, struggle with pornography. 60% of the men in this room, statistically speaking, struggle with pornography. The other 40% struggle with lying. That's not true. I just made that one up right there. It's just take a breath. It's okay. All right? Now, here's why this is important. Regardless of your view of sex, regardless of your view of sex before marriage or after marriage or whatever your view of that is, the truth about every single one of us who get married is we bring all of that baggage right down the center aisle with us. And we walk it down there and we don't take into account that affects our marriage relationship. It affects how we view sexual intimacy. It affects how we view our spouse in the area of sexual intimacy. It affects the baggage and the hurt and the wounds that we may have experienced in that area. Regardless of what our choices, maybe someone else chose that for us. And so we just think to ourselves, if we just love God and we love each other, it's all going to work out. And then we don't understand why we have this distance in this area of our life. And can I just say that there is a difference, a huge difference between forgiveness and healing. Okay, so if you have experienced brokenness in this area and you have felt God convict you about an area of your life, in the area of sexual intimacy, and you have gone to God and said, God, I want to confess this to you, I want you to forgive this, that is instant. Okay, there's nothing you can do to earn it. God takes it away as far as east is from the west. God forgives you. He wipes your slate clean. It does not mean that your heart is healed from that experience. And so often I think we equate forgiveness with healing, and then we don't understand why we have all of these issues in the area of sexual intimacy in our marriage relationship. And it's because we haven't taken the time to do an inventory of our heart and say, okay, God, what is it in my heart in this area that actually needs healed? What is it that it needs to be brought before you? What is it that needs time or counseling or insight or wisdom? And I'm going to give that to you.
But I think the last barrier is where we want to end today is just in this area of a lack of sexual understanding. I kind of put it this way. If we were looking at the church, in church culture, if our marriage was kind of like, I put it this way, we have the emotional side and we have the physical side, right? And it looks kind of nice. It looks like 2 wedding rings. It looks very, safe. And I think if you're honest with me and I'm honest with you, talking about the emotional side of our marriage is easy, right? Like you get into a church fight on the way to church, and then, you're saying all kinds of things you shouldn't say, and then you walk in the door and you're like, hi, oh, we're good, and then you give each other the stink eye, and then the spiritual side. That's where we earn brownie points in marriage at church, right? Me and my man, we are leading a small group, and it's amazing. It's all authentic. It's amazing. Like, that's safe. But when we talk about the physical aspect, it's like its own planet. I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I walked into a small group and said, yeah, we're really struggling in the area of sexual intimacy. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And I think most often it's because we don't have a clear understanding of its purpose. And when God says, listen, I have created you to be fully known, to be fully loved, and in the context of marriage, it's when the physical becomes just as important as the emotional and spiritual. This is what makes marriage dynamic, different, amazing. It's the only relationship here on earth where you get to be known fully, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. But I think what happens is that because we don't have a definition, we allow culture to shape our definition. And the definition has more to do with shame and blame and embarrassment. And so it was an issue, obviously, from the first week where you're married. And then to have infidelity part of our narrative changed everything. Right? God, how can you redeem such a messed up part of our relationship? And so Justin and I made a commitment to really search out the scriptures, to read anything that we could on the area of sexual intimacy. And it began for me when I started understanding male dynamics. Like, this is the part where people are like, oh my gosh, what pictures are you going to show next? Like, I don't mean so much like that. Like, how many daddies of daughters do I have here today? Raise your hand. All right, how many daddies of teenage daughters do you have? Right? I'm praying for you, right? Like, talk to a daddy who has a daughter, especially a teenage daughter. They have to understand female dynamics, right? Because if they don't understand PMS, you're gonna die, right? Like, you need to understand that. But if you talk to a daddy of a daughter who's got a teenager who's entering into puberty, they see that puberty with purpose. There's a hope that one day that their child will be able to bear grandchildren. There's hope and purpose in it. But then when you start talking about boys, man, I talk to so many scared mamas who, when they think about their son entering into puberty, they completely freak out. They place the blame and the shame of the narrative of our culture rather than seeking the truth of what God says about them. So Justin and I started reading this book called Every Man's Battle. I think everybody should read it. I'll be honest with you, I threw it across the room a couple of times because it was just obliterating my point of view of sexual intimacy. But it really captures the reality of not just the physiological side of how your husband or your son is wired, but the spiritual side. And then he created this book called Preparing Your Son for Every Man's Battle. And I remember Micah was probably 10 or 11. They were about to do the talk at school. He goes to public school, and they were going to show the video. And so I'm like, Justin, maybe we should take him through this book. But I'm like, listen, I carried this child for 9 months. It was a long birthing process. You're having the sex talks. Good luck.
So we start reading this book together, and I don't know what to do. I mean, it was my first kid, so I'm like, okay, I just want it to be different than it was with my dad and I. My dad and I's conversation was, don't do it. All right? Any questions? And so I wanted it to be different for Micah, and so we start reading this book together, and so we go to Starbucks because I feel like if it were in public, it can't go too far south. And so the book is divided up. The first half is for dads to read by themselves. The second half is for dads to read with their sons, and there's discussion questions at the end of each chapter. And so we're sitting in Starbucks and we're reading the book, and the title of the chapter is Sexual Intercourse. So there's not really any way of getting around what we're going to talk about. It's going to happen. And so he gets done reading, and his eyes are just like really big, and my hands are really sweaty. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I said, so do you have any questions for me? And I'm like, please, Jesus, no. Right? And he's like, so let me get this straight. You and mom have been intimate more than 3 times, because 3 kids, 3 times. I said, yes. He's like, can you do this for fun? I said, well, when the moon's aligned with Jupiter, sometimes we do. He's like, well, when's the last time you did it? I said, that's none of your business, all right? We're not talking about that. And so we come home, and he is so non-emotional, but he just loses his mind. He falls on the floor. He's banging his hands on the floor, laughing, and he can't even look at Trish.
So I'm like, buddy, what's going on? And he's like, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like Sanford and Son. I'm like, take me now, Jesus. He's like, Dad told me you all are active. And I was like,
I wanted to be
active?
technical. I wanted
Yeah.
to have, the scientific terminology.
What I realized in that moment of that conversation is that the only narrative that Micah knew about his physical body and how God designed him, about sexual intimacy, is Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. That although Adam and his wife were both naked, they felt no shame. And so he walked confidently in it. A couple of months later, I'll never forget, if you have kids, you just know that there's certain sounds that happen in your house. You know a fight's about to ensue. And so I'm downstairs in our office, and I hear the bathroom door downstairs swing wide open and hit the door or hit the wall. And then I just kind of wait for someone to start screaming or start yelling. I hear someone run up the stairs, and I was like, oh, Justin's upstairs, I'll let him deal with it, right? And then I was on the phone, I went back to my phone conversation.
So I hear the bathroom doors swing open, and I'm upstairs, I'm doing what every good dad does on a Saturday morning, I'm playing Xbox Live, and spending real quality time with my kids. And Micah's like screaming, Dad, you gotta check this out, it's amazing, it's unbelievable. I'm like, buddy, I'm playing a game right now, can't pause it. I needed 5 minutes. He's like, no, you gotta look at this right now. I'm like, buddy, I can't pause my game. He's like, which is more important to you? Me or the game? I'm like, fine, guilt tripper. So I turn, I look, and he is standing right here, buck naked. I'm like, whoa, back up, my friend. What is going on? He's like, I have a hair. And I'm like, well, how did I miss that? Like, why don't you step back a couple of steps so I can see that? And I'm like, you know what? I said, you're the man. Like, you are literally the man. I said, you know what you need to do with that? He's like, what? I said, go show mom. So we've never been invited to speak on parenting. I don't understand.
No. So I'm downstairs in the office. I'm on the phone with my girlfriend, Joan, and I hear someone walk in, and somebody's tapping my shoulder, and I'm like, just going like this. And then now he's like bruising me. He's hitting me so hard. So I swing, and I'm on the phone. And because I'm on the phone, Mike is standing there in all his glory. He whispers, Mom, look, I have hair. And I was like, I did what any good mama does. I was like, good job, buddy, right? You know, like pull up his pants, and then he went on his merry way. And I think this is what happens. This is what happens. He was given a biblical view of how God designed him. But what if? What if that moment I turned to chapter 3 and said, did God really say? What if that moment I looked at my son in his innocence and said, Micah, that is disgusting. We don't talk about those things. I hate that you're going to enter into puberty. Now I have to worry about masturbation. I have to worry about pornography. I have to worry about all of these things, and I just don't want to go there. Don't bring this up to me again. Go to your room. You should be embarrassed. And if I'm honest, I believe generation after generation after generation of our men have been told that lie, that somehow entering into puberty innately makes them evil and sinful. But when I read Psalm 139, it says, God, He made every part of our bodies. It says not all. It doesn't say some. It says all of the delicate inner parts of my body were created by God. It goes on to say that not only did He create us in the womb, that every day is recorded before puberty and after puberty. That if we want to reclaim this area of intimacy in our marriage relationship, we have to begin to see our husbands in the purity of which God created them. And when we're able to understand male dynamics, when we're able to reclaim God's vision of Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, then we begin to understand. Next is that we understand our significance as wives. Because I get it. I've been my full-term pregnancy weight for about 8 years and have not been able to lose it. I've gained weight, I've lost weight, I'm over 40, I'm getting wrinkles, Mike is getting married. Every time I say that, I pop another one. You know, like, I'm not reversing the clock in here, right? And so then I had issues with it because I had sex before I married Justin, and so all of that baggage I carried into our relationship. And then I got to a place where my marriage was dissolving because of extramarital affair. I mean, I could not be more messed up in this area, but God, He redeems it. And He's given me a completely different view of understanding my significance in it. Because listen, you can talk to someone who has struggled with pornography. You can talk to someone who has hurt their marriage with infidelity. And what they will tell you is that it brings them to Genesis chapter 3. That in the moment it may bring gratification, but the ramifications of it are pain and shame and hiddenness. It does not bring life. But then when I read this passage found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2 through 5, it's my favorite. Who knew? This is the Message version, and it says this. It says, sexual drives are strong, but marriage is strong enough to contain them and provide for a balanced and fulfilling sexual life in a world of sexual disorder. Don't miss it. He says, sexual drives are strong. It's like, I know, I created them. But listen, marriage is not just strong enough to contain them and it will provide for a balanced and fulfilling sexual life in a world of sexual disorder. The problem is we have to read and live out the second half of the chapter, or of the verse, and it says this, that the marriage bed must be a place of mutuality. The husband seeking to satisfy his wife, the wife seeking to satisfy her husband. It goes on to say that marriage is not a place to stand up for your rights. Marriage is a decision. It's a decision to serve one another, whether in bed or out. You see, intimacy in our relationship was restored when truth was told, when forgiveness was given, when we walked the long journey of finding healing for our sexual brokenness, and we took on the reality and the truth that God created intimacy, not for you to struggle, not for you to feel like you'll never be enough, but God says, listen, I have uniquely created you to be known by your spouse emotionally and spiritually, and when you engage physically, it's like the exclamation point of your relationship, of realizing that nobody else gets to experience that type of intimacy. And I'm telling you, once you experience it, it will outshine and it will dull the other woman, the other man. It will outshine and it will dull the struggle with pornography. Is it easy? No. Do you have to fight for it? Yes. Is it worth it? Always.
You know what I love about that passage is it was written 2,000 years ago, and yet it has so much relevance today. And it ends with really the theme that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, this mutual submission, that marriage is not a place to stand up for your rights, it's a place to serve the other, whether in bed or out. So he includes sexual intimacy in this idea of mutual submission. I want to close our time just talking to guys and what we can do to really further this idea of intimacy in our marriage relationship. The first thing I would say, and I tell my boys this all the time, is we need to guard our heart and mind. I tell my boys this, nobody's going to guard your heart for you. Like, it has to be a proactive decision. Like, you're not going to reactively just guard your heart. Like, you know, that passage, there's a world of sexual disorder. I don't know if you've watched TV in the last, 24 hours, but sex is everywhere. And we have become so desensitized to it because we haven't really taken into account that what we put into our heart and mind really affects how we view women, how we view sexual intimacy, and the expectations that we project based on our view of it. I love this passage of Scripture in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. It says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. There's this reality, there's this principle that we can't, no matter how gifted, no matter how talented, no matter how spiritual you are, you cannot cheat this principle. That when you want to think about sexual intimacy in the way that God has created you to, you're going to have to change what you put into your heart and mind. You're going to have to guard it. Whatever is true, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. I had to do an inventory of my life in order to regain trust and to regain intimacy in my marriage. I had to say, okay, what am I putting into my heart and mind that is causing me, perpetuating the struggle that I actually have? And it wasn't until I was willing to be honest with myself and identify those things that I was able to make some changes in my life that grew our relationship. Secondly, be open and honest about your past, your thoughts, and your struggles. I mentioned that Trish and I started going to counseling together. We went to counseling 4 days a week. So after 30 days, we'd gone to 16 counseling sessions. That's a year's worth of counseling in 30 days. And we had made a lot of progress. Our counselor was like, man, trust is starting to be rebuilt. We'd circled a date on the calendar. I was going to move back home. It was going to be amazing. He said, Justin, if you've left anything out, now's the time to share it. Trish is starting to regain trust in you, and unconfessed sin will always lead to repeated behavior. So if you don't want to be back here in 3 months or 3 years or 13 years, you better come clean. And I knew in my heart I had left some things out. Not because I wanted to lie to Trish, I wanted to protect her. But I realized that in this moment, this wasn't about my marriage anymore. This was about me and whether or not I was willing to live in a right relationship with God. and find healing from the things that I had struggled with. And so I just took a deep breath and I said, as far as that relationship goes, I've told you everything, but I have a lot more to share. I said I was sexually abused when I was a kid, and I've never talked about it. I've never told anyone about it. I've never gotten help for it. There's a part of my heart that's broken, and I can't fix it. And I said I've struggled with pornography for the last 10 years, and I've deflected it. I've denied it. I've preached against it. I've counseled people through it. And if you want to divorce me, you can have everything. This isn't about us anymore. This is about me finally living in a right relationship with God. And in an act of grace and mercy, unlike anything I'd ever experienced, she said, now we can start over. Now we can begin again because I finally know the real you. And that wasn't the finish line. That was the start of a 2-year process of me finding healing and wholeness and breaking free from that addiction. But it wasn't until I was honest with myself about my past, my thoughts, and my struggles that I was actually able to overcome them. And I think so often what happens for us guys is we think that we're better than what we really are. At least we tell ourselves the best stories about ourselves, and we don't understand why we struggle. Self-deception is the chief of all deception, because if we can deceive ourselves, then we can deceive anyone. And so that was a huge step for me. And then finally, I'll close with this. We need to pursue our wife. And if you're married, I'll say this: pursue your wife for more than just sex. Trish and I had this pattern of behavior in our marriage where I would pursue her when I wanted something in return. And when we do that as men, it doesn't make our wives feel valued, it makes them feel used. And so I had to learn what it meant to pursue my wife to gain nothing in return. Like, the first week in the series, we talked about how the best relationships are ones that give up what is best for themselves for the betterment of the relationship. And when you take into account, when you start pursuing your wife emotionally and you start pursuing and leading spiritually, physical intimacy is not something that is an obligation. It's not something that's a coercion. It's not something that you need to talk her into. It's not something that you need a guilt trip about. It becomes a natural overflow of a relationship because God created it. And God didn't give it to us to be embarrassed by it. He gave it to us as a gift, to be celebrated and encouraged. So here's what I hope happens today. We're going to close in prayer here in just a second. We wanted to share this message with you today out of the context of our own story, because if God can meet us, he can meet any of you. If God can bring us out of literally the depths of destruction in this area, no matter where you are, if you're dating, single, divorced, married, no matter what your intimacy life looks like or your perception of intimacy. And there's been some things that I've said today or Trish said today that you don't agree with. I understand that. That's why we say Hope City is a place where you can belong before you believe. You don't have to believe what we believe. Our hope today was to share with you our own personal journey and what God's word says. And I hope, my prayer has been that you would find yourself in the story and realize that God longs for this for you. Like, God created this for you. God isn't trying to punish us or dangle a carrot in front of us or, convict us to a life of suffering or struggling in this area. He longs for us to find freedom and hope and joy. And that's the journey that the best relationships are on. And we want to help you get there. That's the whole point of this series. Let's pray together.